is Brooke Medina. I'm the Vice President of Communications here at the John Locke Foundation, and we're delighted for you to be here both in person and to our online audience. Thank you guys for joining us. We will have time for a robust Q&A at the end of this, so please save your questions for the end unless Donna decides to go rogue, and then she will tell you, ask the questions, all of them, at one time. And please, if you're watching online, make sure you ask questions there as well. Brene will be able to field those questions, and we can ask them on your behalf. But this is a really exciting Shaftesbury, especially when you are in Raleigh and you're at the epicenter of North Carolina politics, and there's just a lot going on. There's a lot riding on this election. There always is, but there's just some interesting stories that our CJ reporters have been covering. So we're really excited to dig into that. But before they begin, I wanted to mention to you all that we have the new North Carolina Economic Performance Fact Book available on johnlocke.org as well as in person. So if you're here in person and would like a copy, please let me know and we will grab you one. But this is, as you all, most of you probably know, CNBC designated North Carolina as the #1 state to do business in. And our Economic Performance Fact Book assesses the business climate in North Carolina, as well as just a host of other economic-related issues in North Carolina to assess really how we're doing on the policy front as it relates to budget and taxes, et cetera. So please check that out. It's an exciting and very visually graphic-heavy piece of a resource for you. And also, we have our Civitas poll that is going on the road, which, as we near the election, the Civitas poll seems to get a lot more traction and interest. So we are going to be polling the U.S. Senate race here in North Carolina, as well as a number of other races, Biden approval numbers, but we're taking it on the road this month. And so we will be at the Jesse Helms Center in Wingate. So if you're in the Charlotte area and are watching, we would love for you to join us. You can get tickets at johnlocke.org/events. And then lastly, we just want to thank you guys for investing in freedom. We appreciate your support of the John Locke Foundation. We cannot do what we do without you all, and we appreciate your support. And so thank you so much for your support, but also your encouragement and just being a fellow defender of freedom with us. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Donna King. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I'm so glad to see you all here. It's great to see a full in-person room. I'm Donna King. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Carolina Journal, and this is Ray Nothstein, who's the opinion editor of the Carolina Journal, and Teresa Opeka, who is our State House reporter. She's really been working hard over the last year or so, getting a lot of General Assembly coverage out there, because I feel like it's something that maybe outside of this room and our immediate ecosystem, we don't see enough General Assembly coverage and really know what's going on there. Of course, we are down to the short rows here ahead of the election. The early voting period starts a week from Thursday, October 20th. So we're going to be doing a lot of coverage here, and I appreciate all of your support in reading it, and we'll be bringing you everything that we find out, and of course through our polls and interviews and inside take on some of the fantastic work folks like Jim Sterling are doing and keeping track of all the money that's going into these elections. North Carolina, of course, we're on the national radar to really see where we fall, because while we are, purple, we're very blue and very red in many areas. So it's interesting to watch. So going into November, where we are right now, North Carolina is 30% roughly registered Republicans, 34% registered Democrats, and about 35% registered unaffiliated. So these races are really tight, and you see the messaging happening in key districts like 13, the 13th Congressional District is showing both Wiley Nickel and Bo Hines trying to be a little bit more moderate, perhaps, in how they're approaching their messaging, more so than in other districts that are not as competitive. Emerging, of course, as key issues we're seeing is inflation. For the Republicans, they're focused very heavily on that. Democrats are focused very heavily on the Dobbs decision and abortion policy. You can see it, it's happening every single day. On Friday, I believe it was, Thursday or Friday, the NCGOP had Marsha Blackburn in town to really talk about the cost of inflation. She's saying $7,500 in the average North Carolina family's budget is the cost of inflation, the increase in goods and gasoline and In our poll, 56% of people said they're having a harder time buying food. Republicans are really focused on that message, but Democrats are getting a lot of traction, it seems, talking about abortion restrictions or abortion access. They must have polled the word extremist, and it must have really gone through the roof for them, because it seems to be a primary word used in every ad, every talking point, and it seems to be resonating, because right now Ted Budd and Sherry Beasley are in a statistical dead heat, right at 44% or so. And it seems to be working. You wouldn't think, with inflation being what it was, that it would be that close. But it's possible also that Republicans are underpolled, and so we're seeing a lot of that. But when you look at that statistical dead heat at 44%, Ted Budd in a WRAL poll recently had a slight edge over her. The generic ballot for Republicans, meaning if you walked in today, would you vote for the Republican or would you vote for the Democrat? The generic Republican ballot is outperforming Budd at the moment, around 47% of folks saying that, I'm not sure what I would do, but if I walked in and it was a choice between a Republican and Democrat, 47% are saying that they would vote for the Republican, to about 44% they would vote for the Democrat. So that gives us a little insight into who is resonating with voters, and maybe it's messaging. It might be, the kitchen table issues that we've been really focused on. But I think that what we're seeing is a lot of frustration with polarization. People are getting tired of hearing all of it, and they're getting tired of what they're seeing at their kitchen table and their family budgets. So we're reporting on a lot of that, and how it looks when people walk into the voting booth really is something that we're going to be dissecting ahead of 2024, of course. So those key issues are something you're talking a lot about in the opinion section.
Absolutely, and real quick, because this reflects what you said, Donna. But there's so many independent voters in North Carolina that when I went to go vote last time, they're like, "You're an independent." And I was like, I didn't even know that. So that's how many independent voters there are in this state. When I asked for my ballot, they're like, "Which ballot do you want?" And they're like, "You're independent." And I was like, "Okay." So I think that just reflects the amount of just independence. But one of the things I think is key about North Carolina, and I've noticed this ever since I've lived here, is that North Carolina reflects national polls really well. And I think that is continuing, that trend continues. Former Speaker Tip O'Neill said that all politics is local, but I think there's a lot of national trends that you can take and infuse into North Carolina because of the reflection in the polling is so similar. I mean, you can just jump on a national poll and then jump on the polls that we do here at Locke and see this similarity. And the points will just be off just by a little bit, a few percentage points when they are off. So, I mean, it just shows you how we're so homogenous, kind of the rest of the country. I mean, North Carolina now, when we think of swing states, right, in elections, we think of Florida and Ohio. But North Carolina now is a quintessential swing state. I mean, Florida and Ohio have become much more Republican. And North Carolina, if anything, is more independent, and it's harder to predict what's going to happen here. Now, I do think that there's some trends, obviously, that is encouraging for the Republican Party in general in North Carolina. I think what you're going to see in this Senate race, which everybody's so interested in, is probably Budd win, because he's not going to make any mistakes. He's focused on issues like crime, like inflation, that are top issues with voters right now. And if you continue focusing on those issues and you don't make a big gaffe or a big mistake, I think because of past history and because of the political climate here, he'll do well. And I think he might outperform the polling numbers that you're seeing. And I think one of the things that might help Budd a little bit, just if you look at the national landscape, is there's some subpar Republican candidates in the Senate. And I wonder if that has an effect in North Carolina. Say, well, he may not be the best candidate, but he's not embarrassing himself like some of the other Republican candidates running for Senate. So I wonder if that sort of impact has a little bit of help on Budd. And I think, in general, I think it's hard for Sherry Beasley to ultimately pull this out in this climate. If the climate was different, if you had someone else besides Joe Biden in office, you saw in that debate where she tried, like all the Democrat candidates, virtually all of them anyways, out there trying to pivot away from the president. He's very unpopular. If you look at the numbers in North Carolina, he's even more unpopular in North Carolina than he is nationally. Again, 3 or 4 percentage points less popular here than he is nationally. So it's just hard to have a path, I think, for Beasley. And it seems like to some degree that the National Democrats are not spending. She's complained about the money coming into the state. It's not enough. Bud seems like he's outspending her now, especially with the independent expenditures. So when you look at kind of past history, some of the past Senate races, I expect Bud to do a little bit better than the numbers that we're seeing just from a polling standpoint. And a lot of the national prognosticators too, and some of the North Carolina prognosticators are picking Bud to win that race. And I think that's going to end up happening. So when you look at the Senate race, it just seems like one of those ones that is going to, at the end of the day, is going to be strong for Republicans. But if Beasley can get Bud off message, and I think one of the things, if you're a Republican, is why aren't you just talking about crime and inflation, because those numbers work so well for you in the polling. If she can get him off message, if she can get him to focus on something else, then that would be advantageous for her and for Democrats. And that's always possible. I mean, politics is the art of the unpredictable. So we'll see what happens in that race. But I would expect Republicans to win that seat, and it may be not as close as some people think and what the polling is saying right now.
Sure.
If you want to add anything to that.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things that we've been watching, of course, is where are independent expenditure groups, where are outside the state parties and groups coming in and spending money. One of the things that we're seeing is up in District 1, Sandy Smith and Don Davis. So Don Davis being a relatively conservative Democrat, Sandy Smith really embraced some of the controversy she had during the primary. She's outraised him. She's got like $1.5 million, and he's right at around 900,000. She's outspending him too, but she's outraising him. So for that particular district, which leans Democrat, to become more competitive, I think says a lot about where that district is, of course, but how a candidate like Sandy Smith can, who did not have a Trump endorsement early but got one recently in the Save America rally, how she can be raising that kind of money and resonating with voters. That had a really fierce primary there. There were a lot of different candidates that were vying for that role, and I think she was probably one of the more controversial candidates in that primary. And she owned it and came out, and a lot of that, I think, was because of her vehement support of former President Donald Trump, and it may be really speaking to voters there. Don Davis has got some ads out that are, very positive and talking about his role in the church and the community and that kind of thing. So it is interesting that she's able to really connect with those voters over there in District 1. That will be something which, if you remember, was G.K. Butterfield's G.K. Butterfield's district and had been for many, many years. He won it 70% most of the time. So if she does as well, even if she comes close, I think it says a lot about what that district is becoming, very similar like we're seeing in 13, Johnson County in that area, which is become more of a suburb of Wake. Those candidates, Bo Hines, trying to sort of move to the middle and get that suburban voter. One of the things that we've been focused on here at Carolina Journal and in the John Locke Foundation is to talk about getting people to fill out their entire ballot. So it's really important that these down ballot races get the attention that some of the big ones that we've been focused on get as well, because something like 700,000 people in the last election didn't fill out their entire ballot. They left those spaces blank when it is really the way you can most, in the broadest possible sense, impact your community, local schools, school board races, and county commissioner. And I think some of it is because people don't know the candidates. They don't want to make a mistake. So encouraging people, doing it yourself, encouraging your neighbors to go to the State Board of Elections website and look at your sample ballot ahead of time, doing a little bit of homework, getting people to really pay attention to what's happening down ballot. Of course, we in this room pretty much know that the North Carolina Supreme Court race is critical this year. There are 2 seats up for grabs, one of them, of course, being Irvin running for re-election. But those 2 seats right now, if Republicans flip just one, it goes back from leaning left to leaning right. And that's something that those 2 races are critical right now. Richard Dietz and Lucy Inman running against each other. They're both on the Court of Appeals, have been since 2014 or so. they're very different candidates. Now, to hear them talk, they don't sound that different. Some of us, I think, saw them at the Federalist Society. They don't sound that different, but when you look at their background and some of the decisions they've made, that's worth really looking into. Lucy Inman, if you're unfamiliar with her, she is from Raleigh. She is really ingrained in the Democrat established, politics. She's from the Daniels family, and she started off as a reporter. She went back to law school. She was appointed as Superior Court judge by, I think, Bev Perdue. Somebody else here might know that as well. So she's really been a part of the Democrat establishment for a very long time now, running for the North Carolina Supreme Court. Her challenger, who is Richard Dietz, he is a bootstraps kind of guy. He says he comes from working class or railroad, type family. He is, he's really emerged as being pretty straightforward. He is doing fairly well. He and Trey Allen are both polling above their candidates right now. In Trey Allen and Jimmy Irving, he's polling above him as well, former Marine. Irvin is a part of that Democrat establishment as well. His father was a judge. His grandfather was a U.S. senator. He focused a lot on that in that Federalist Society event. His sort of pedigree in North Carolina Democrat politics, but their challengers are not raising as much money as they are. But both of those Republicans seem to be polling ahead of them and moving above them and polling higher than they are in what we're seeing. So I think it is interesting to see those sort of bootstraps, relative newcomer. They've been around for a long time and a real part of North Carolina's judiciary. But to see them doing better than these establishment Democrat candidates is interesting because they're not outraising them. So that's something that we're going to be watching pretty closely, particularly as you have the backdrop of the North Carolina Supreme Court getting some controversy. That 4-3 Democrat leaning has been accused of some real partisan decisions over the last year or two, particularly when it comes to maps and the decision to hear voter ID and to hear the cases about the maps happening over in Edenton last week. If you had a chance to read our coverage on that, the decision to go ahead and hear those instead of pushing them to 2023 garnered some criticism that they were leaving maybe nonpartisan cases unheard, but picking and choosing those cases. They did decide to push off felon. Mitch isn't here, but we were talking a lot about the felon voting case. They've decided to push that off until 2023, but accelerated the process for voter ID and maps. And, it's in our recent poll, voter ID is polling now, it's around 62%, which is a higher rate than it even passed in 2018, around, I think it was 51, 52, 55% in 2018. It's actually polling higher. So it's gaining steam, even though it's being challenged at the North Carolina Supreme Court. When we had those four candidates, John Hood was the moderator there for that Federalist Society event. All of them said it's to some degree that a partisan court is alarming and it was dangerous to the body. But yet we're seeing more and more focus and more criticism of the court on what appears to be a partisan leaning. So having those candidates doing so well may be a backlash. It may be a reflection of that support for a generic Republican ballot. And it overall may be concerned, folks may be concerned about the judiciary, protecting the health and the integrity of the judiciary. So we're going to be watching those really, really closely. But then talking about filling your down ballot and how important it is to know who your local person is, not just focusing on, Beasley and Bud, because that's what we're all talking about right now. What affects you the most is your county commissioner, your school board, and of course your state legislative representative and senator. Now, Teresa's been focused really heavily on that in her coverage. Fill us in a little bit on what you think we're seeing ahead for November.
Okay. So, and also going to take a look at the Civitas Partisan Index. That's courtesy of our own locks, Jim Sterling and Dr. Annie Jackson. That everybody agrees, most most everybody agrees that the GOP does have a lock on keeping the state legislature. What is up for grabs is a supermajority. And there's been some pretty good agreement, but it's also a fluid situation, as we're all seeing about prices of inflation, gas going up as we get closer and closer to the election. Stay tuned, in other words. So, and basically what we have for Civitas Partisan Index, Republicans, like they say, how do you get the supermajority? Republicans must win 72 seats in the House and also 30 in the Senate to gain supermajorities. I did write a piece for the print edition that looks like that may be an uphill battle, and I'll explain that in a little bit. So the CPI, they measure base partisan leanings of North Carolina state legislature districts compared to the state as a whole. And if you were just using those numbers and you wanted to predict elections, about 90% of the state legislature races in 2018 and over 94% of the races in 2020 were predicted correctly by CPI. So that's pretty good odds when you look at that. And also in the House, Republicans currently have a baseline advantage in 58 districts compared to 56, with Democrat baseline advantage in 6 toss-up seats. Let's just give you a little bit of a look into that. So also the CPI took a look at the political environment. Right now, usually for midterms, President Party does suffer losses. That's always a given, and that might be the case this year. But what we looked at for polling and from people that I talked with as well for the article is Democrats really bolstered their numbers over the summer. They seem to have trended popular, and a big focus of that was the Dobbs decision, Roe v. Wade being overturned by the Supreme Court. It seems like the Democrats' sole focus has been about abortion. But that may prove to be not such a great idea as we're getting closer and closer with everything going up in price. As people are having a harder time, as I said before, at the kitchen table, looking at their bills, looking at what they can afford. Maybe you're looking for a house. Yeah, there's more competition right now, but interest rates have gone up, so your buying power is down significantly. So that's definitely not helping. Basically, Democrats did close the gap over the summer. And also the CPI took a look at individual campaigns and candidates. So if you've got a really well-run campaign, strong candidate, you may do really well. And there's also plenty of races to watch, which we'll get into that in a moment. And all that stuff seemed to change with redistricting. You kind of need a scorecard to keep track of where your representatives are at the moment, just to see where they are. So basically in the House, I'm just going to mention this as well, Republicans must win in 14 of the 19 toss-ups and lean Democrat districts, and also to win a supermajority, Democrats must win about 18 of them to get a simple majority. So some of those toss-up districts we're looking at in District 9, we've got incumbent Brian Farkas. He is challenging Timothy Reeder. That's one of the races that we're taking a look at. Also, incumbent Robert Reeves, who is in District 54, and that is with Chatham and Randolph County. He is up against Walter Petty. And if you flip over to the House, you have District 17, Wake, Sidney Batch is one to watch over Mark Cavallariero, probably mispronouncing the name. And in District 4, Green, Wayne Wilson, we've got incumbent Milton Toby Fitch going on Buck Newton. So what I mentioned before about being a fluid situation, there's been plenty of national polls as well, like Trafalgar and other ones saying that Democrats, they are in a free fall with different voters right now, specifically some Latino voters. Republicans are gaining ground. They're gaining ground across the country. As we mentioned, disposable income is dropping due to inflation, high housing costs, grocery prices going up. It's a best guess situation, but we're like talking about the congressional race like Budd and Beasley, how it's so close. I think that's how you're going to see these races. They're going to be pretty close. I'm not discounting what anybody said before, but I think it is kind of fluid. Things are changing. And as we see, gas prices are going up again. I think everything has a factor in the races this year, but it is important to vote everything on the ballot, to know where your districts, your representatives are. As we mentioned, redistricting was such a hot topic, and it kind of left things a bit of a mess. So you have to really know what you're doing, but everything is super critical. And I think not resting on your laurels when it comes to voting, saying, no, they're going to be fine. You need to get out and vote and not focus on just one issue. What are the most important issues? Abortion is definitely an important issue, but I mean, the economy and how well you're doing this year and how you're seeing things rising in the grocery stores, things maybe you're not going to be buying any longer. I think people are really, really focused on that. And I think that has all to come down with the legislature. So stay tuned for the supermajority.
Yeah, I think you make a really good point about the abortion issue, because if you make that a focus,
right,
and people pivot away from that to some degree, I do think it's kind of a waning issue in the mind of a lot of voters. So I think there'll be a lot of voters out there, particularly in swing districts, who are going to say, you know, why haven't you addressed crime? Why haven't you addressed inflation? I mean, you see a situation right now in New York State where the governor, Kathy Hochul, I think her name is,
yes,
she's in trouble because she's kind of been focusing on deep blue issues without talking about crime. She says she addresses crime, which is a huge, obviously, in New York City, and says, well, we got to wait for these studies to come back. We have to wait for these commissions to come back. But people are being killed on the subway. People are being attacked. And her challenger, Lee Zeldin, who ended up having a shooting just outside of his home, and he had a pretty badly planned assassination attempt against him this year. You can see it on YouTube. I think some crazy guy with a knife or something. But at any rate, I just think, you know, you're seeing areas of the country where Republicans are not expected to do well, even in a climate like this or a midterm like this, where the competition is really heating up. And so when you kind of see stuff like that, I think you can start to deduce some things for North Carolina that you may not otherwise be able to deduce in a regular election climate.
I also find that while I do think that a lot of these pollsters make adjustments in their formulas, and this is an art and a science at the same time, some of these polls do end up undercounting Republicans. We saw that big lesson in 2016, 2020, that there are a lot of, whether it's because they don't have a cell phone with them at work and aren't willing or able to answer a poll, they tend to be undercounted. It's much easier. And then we had a great interview with the pollster who does the signal polling. He said, look, you know, one of the things we run into is it's easy to get, you know, a college-educated, woman who tends to be left-leaning or unaffiliated. It's a little easier to get them on the phone than maybe a non-college-educated working man. He goes, we just have to account for that, and it leads to undercounting in some of these polls. And I do think we're probably seeing that. They adjust for it. But, you know, we've seen that all along. And you know, going back to the fundraising part, you know, we're seeing a lot of money come in from out of state, particularly coming through that Act Blue. It's Democrats, you know, huge fundraising arm to pour into Democrat candidates, but Republicans are still seem to be, you know, hanging on despite that influx of money. Sherry Beasley not enjoying that benefit as much as Ted Budd seems to be. Democrats just don't seem to be showing up for her in the Senate race here at the end, when normally we would see this huge push. Cal Cunningham got a tremendous amount of money from national Democrats ahead of his race with Tom Tillis. He, you know, I think sort of defeated himself in that particular instance. But Sherry Beasley doesn't seem to be getting that same influx of money. But if you look at, you know, what we're saying is Irvin and Allen, that race that we have going on right there, Irvin is defending his seat, but he's becoming saddled with the reputation of a partisan court. And that's something that I think is not lost on particularly on people who will go through and pay attention to that to those Supreme Court races. So, you know, I think that there's a lot going on in North Carolina, and it's something that school boards, particularly when you talk down into the school board races. Look at Loudoun County, Virginia. That one trend of a few parents showing up at a school board and objecting to what they were seeing during the closures and what they were seeing in critical race theory and crime on campus. That school board meeting in Loudoun County, Virginia, started a trend that upset the state leadership. It's one of the reasons Glenn Youngkin was able to win there. And so that shows you the importance at a local community level, what an election can do to start a national trend. And I do think that that's one of the most powerful things that we've seen in the last 6 or 8 months. I know Kelly Mann has been working really, really well with some of these grassroots people who want to enact change at the school board level. We're seeing a ton of new candidates out there. I'd encourage you to go through, find out who they are, because a lot of folks decided not to run for re-election on the school boards because it was a really difficult year to get through the pandemic, and these policy issues sort of flew under the radar for a long time. So we have lots of new candidates, but a new candidate doesn't always mean a better candidate. So it's important to go through and look at their websites, try and find out more about them. We're doing what we can to cover them as well. But voting down ballot, getting all of those races, all of those spaces filled in is a really critical part of this election, not just Budd and Beasley. So I don't know if you got a chance to see the debate on Spectrum on Friday. Switching back to Budd and Beasley, we saw, again, that focus on abortion access versus inflation. It was constant. Those issues are being hammered through, and we're not really talking as much about national security, and we're not talking not nearly enough about energy policy, about the difference between unemployment rates and labor participation rates. These are really important issues, and I feel like all I'm hearing about is inflation and abortion access. And inflation is critical to me as well, but getting through and getting a chance to go through and talk more about some of these deeper issues and policy points and voting records and things like that, because I think the Budd campaign is really trying to focus on Beasley's time as a public defender, some of the cases that she covered, and they're really trying to paint her as soft on crime. She has made a point to not show up for some of the events. Appears to have made a point to not show up for some of the events with Biden administration officials in an effort to distance herself likely from some of the controversial policies that are coming out of the White House. The question is do you think that she would still support them if she was there, if she was in the Senate? And the other side is that look at Ted Budd's voting record, because he's got a fantastic way to go and see exactly what he would do if he were in the Senate, because he's done it in Congress. So, it really is important to go back and do your homework. And I feel like we are at Carolina Journal really trying to do that. So we're presenting as much information as we can. But fortunately, we have two candidates, former North Carolina Supreme Court Justice and a sitting congressman. There's lots of information out there where you can really research and try and decide where you fall. Because right now, about 8% of people still say they're undecided in that race. And they're two very different candidates. Now, where they end up, splitting off and falling as it gets closer and closer, it's hard to say, but it may be that they're just not answering. When you look at the Republican generic ballot, they may be walking in and saying, I know how I'm going to vote. I don't like either one, or I really don't know who they are. But in the end, that Republican generic ballot, they may decide to go in there and just, vote their instinctive party. So, it really is an interesting part of our opinion section is fantastic if you want some of that perspective on where, people that you follow and pay attention to, where they're falling on some of these issues that we're talking about. Some folks in here actually have done some op-eds for us.
Yeah, we have lots.
Yeah. So give me some pointers on, how you should be writing an op-ed, particularly as we get closer to the election, that it gets some attention, because Brene knows it is not easy to get social media eyes these days. We've got so much content going through. So you have any tips for us on how to get that stuff out there?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I could give op-ed tips all day. I mean, I think the main thing is to get to the main point right away if you're writing an op-ed. is get to the main point. I'll get a lot of submissions where I don't really know what they're trying to say, or they'll be passive in what they're trying to say. And I think it's an opportunity. Anytime you're a writer, I think it's an opportunity to be authentic, to say what you mean, to put down on paper what exactly you mean, what you're trying to convey to the readers. And so if you would like to submit an op-ed to Carolina Journal, we'd love to have it. So I think if you're looking at tips, just to be authentic, get to the main point right away. I think I jotted down a couple notes. I think one of the main things too is just to kind of cut out any fluffy or vague language. You can go to any website. There's like 2 or 3, I don't remember the names of them, but they have, it's like opedtips.com or something like that. It's not that exactly, but there's a couple websites that I think offer some good points. And I think also just, if you're writing, this is one of the things that I've really, I have a lot of flaws in my life, but one of the things I think I'm somewhat decent at is I try not to assume my audience is super, super smart, and I mean that as a compliment, because a lot of people are smarter in other ways than I am. And so I try to speak to them and try to reach a broad middle in terms of focusing on fundamental principles, but also not trying to be above the head of my audience and try to really convey in a way that I'm trying to reach them that is popular. So I try to popularize my language a little bit and not to be over anybody's head, because don't assume everybody knows everything for something you might study 20, 30, 40 hours a week. They don't. And I get out. One of the things I love about North Carolina is you get outside of, especially urban environments, but you just get outside and people aren't talking about these issues nonstop. And I think that's a healthy thing. It's very Tocquevillian, right? That people are still not obsessed with politics like some of us in this room are from time to time. I think, we tend to be on social media, or we focus on things that are going on, and we go, wow, this country's really messed up. But if you get out, you get out to football games in Eastern North Carolina. I went to ECU football game and a Campbell football game recently. People are normal. People aren't obsessing over politics, and they aren't obsessing over who's going to win the election. And I think those are all good things. So another thing is, I've talked about this before, but read the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson's one of the greatest writers of all time for good reason. He has that rat-a-tat cadence in the Declaration. So if you ever get writer's block or you're having trouble writing, read the Declaration of Independence. There's these great sentences in there that has alarmism in it, but it also has validity. And so that's always been a kind of a helpful starting point. If I'm struggling writing something, I'll just go back and read some of the Declaration of Independence. And that's always been helpful. But I'm happy to work with anybody if they would like help writing an op-ed. This weekend I spent 30, 40 minutes on the phone with somebody who submits, just going over their op-ed and trying to improve it in some areas. So I'm always willing to work with anybody. Sometimes people aren't humble enough to work with, but I have a teachable spirit, and I always like to learn from other people. So if anybody would ever like help writing anything, I would be glad to help them.
Great, great. One of the things I think is a unique opportunity with all of us here, Teresa's actually down at the General Assembly a lot, and not all of us get a chance to look at this through a boots on the ground reporter level. North Carolina's capital coverage has gotten smaller and smaller and smaller. We've got fewer and fewer reporters who are covering the state legislature, which is why we have remained committed to making sure that the state legislature continues to be a focus at Carolina Journal. But it is also harder and harder and harder to do, partly because the Capitol Press Court to some degree controls access to the legislature, and there's fewer and fewer people there. Teresa, tell me a little bit. We've talked a lot lately about the frustration of covering things, but Berger's office recently started holding, sort of quick comments out in front of the red stairs. I don't know, you've probably seen this picture recently. And I think some of that really seems to be to improve reporter and voter access, or writer access to what they're saying, because it really was controlled to a large degree when they would only hold things in that press office. Talk a little bit about your experience.
Yeah, he and his office have been very accessible. We get this email whenever they're going to be holding, sessions that they, Senate Leader Berger would like you to come down. He'll field some questions before the session starts, and make it easier on you. I mean, that's basically what it is. So they've been really, really accessible, really, really great in that respect. So reporters get to ask him questions ahead of time before session starts. And as you mentioned, it is hard as the Capitol pool kind of has a tighter grip on who can be there to ask questions. So it's been very, very helpful and very, very fair. I think that's the key word, fair, for both sides, regardless of what side it is. So it's been very appreciative and very much needed, especially for, like you say, things are getting not as much coverage as maybe they used to, or shrinking. But I definitely agree. That was a very, very good thing they've done.
Right, and Treasurer Falwell is extremely accessible.
Yes.
To reporters and. So there is something to be said about one of the things that I've noticed in the Cooper administration trying to cover state government here is that accessibility is a bit of a problem in some of these executive offices. They have recently started taking public records requests through a portal that gets a little more attention, not that much more attention. So getting records is always going to be a problem. That's something that I would like to see change in the state legislature moving forward, something we can talk about to a greater extent, maybe in something in another forum or something. But Pat Gannon over at the State Board of Elections, very responsive.
Yes.
And I've been impressed with his ability. The Treasurer's Office, very responsive. DPI is very responsive. So, if you're getting engaged at that level and you want information from them, we'd be happy to help you try and learn from our lessons that we've gotten over the years doing this. But accessibility at the state legislature is more important, I think, than people realize, because every paper across the state used to have somebody who did this, or at least had somebody who did it on their behalf and they could share information. We're now talking about 5 people, maybe, that cover the entire state government for North Carolina, and that's just not enough. A lot of folks are turning to Twitter, and I see a lot of folks here in this room that have become de facto reporters because you're sharing information on Twitter, and it is how people are getting their news. And we were just talking about this in a meeting today, that Twitter is really a source of how people are getting their election news this cycle. Facebook you're getting a little bit more opinion, a little bit more depth. But Twitter is becoming a news source in itself, which means every single one of us in this room have become a reporter to some degree. And we've really enjoyed being able to present that information and interact with readers on social media and get letters and emails. But that depth of policy is something I think we are missing a little bit, that we really get through the John Locke Foundation website. And we try and have a lot of that in the opinion section and fill in those gaps, those sort of holes in the Twitter sphere that you just can't get another way. Because a lot of times you end up with votes done on a likability rating rather than public policy. And that's been happening for a while. Sherry Beasley scores pretty high in our polls in favorability. Like, overall, do I like her? Do I think she's a nice person? She appears to be. So she does pretty well in that. Ted Budd doesn't do as well, but I think some of that is because people are really zoning in on that word extremist that Democrats are just driving home in every race across the country. So getting an opportunity to go in and decide where you stand on things like, energy and education, and whether the state government should be regulating industries in healthcare, alcohol, or whatever it is, getting a chance to go in and figure out where you stand. I think so many people don't really know where they stand on these issues. So they go in, they see 2 names, one seems a little bit familiar, they vote and they walk out.
Or you hear a sound bite somewhere, and then you're, okay, I'll just take for what they're, or I have a Yahoo mail address. They have every time that comes up, they have a news, an article, and it's always slanted.
Sure.
It's always so they're like, oh, okay. So I mean, really, you got to do your homework.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And we saw even just this week, the North Carolina GOP said that they see a ton of things go to spam. There's no real evidence. They don't know for sure if that has anything to do with it. But I will say that the way they send things out, if you do have a Yahoo email address, you're going to get things that are more geared to an older voter. Which I think is interesting. They divide it that way. If you have a Gmail, you're getting something very different than if you have a Yahoo, which I think is a really interesting part of this. So I feel like we can take some questions. I think we have, yeah. Oh, yeah.
Amy's been having her hand
Yeah,
up.
Amy, tell me.
So one, we just got a meeting this morning.
Uh-huh.
And I hope you guys will talk about this. Talk about the interest in stories that Carolina
Sure.
produces, and how some of our top stories tend to be on the North Carolina State Supreme Court.
Oh, yes.
Yep.
I give voters and readers, I guess readers, a lot of credit because there is a great deal of interest in it. Would you just touch on that a little bit?
Absolutely. So we are so fortunate to have Brene on board. She analyzes all of our data and tells us what happens. I'm not kidding. Almost every month, one of our top 3 stories are a North Carolina Supreme Court story. We have a readership that really is engaged in what that means and how much that bench of 7 people can affect public policy and what happens in North Carolina politics. And they read it, they know the people involved, they know the cases, and it's this ongoing saga, particularly in some things like the maps or felon voting or whatever it is. People are paying attention, and I think that is overlooked by other news outlets because we get tremendous traction just from if we look just from if we were to look at just clicks and what we want to see get our name out, Supreme Court is a guarantee. If you talk about the North Carolina Supreme Court, it will get traction on social media. If you have a picture of Mark Robinson, it will get traction on social media.
Lots of traction.
Oh, yes.
So you have Mark Robinson calling Eric Adams a clown. Through the roof. So, I mean, it is one of those things that people care about the North Carolina Supreme Court. And I'm actually encouraged to see that because I really think that there are very few bodies that require attention and need the protection. There are very few that need the protection more than the judiciary right now.
I think from an opinion perspective, too, the judicial, my dad's an Air Force pilot, so I lived all over, but the judicial activism in North Carolina is abnormal. This is not normal in most states. So I think that's important to the point of readers gravitating to some of these stories, that there's a lot of energy around these races, because this is not normal government, what's happening. And, I'm giving my opinion here, but what's happening from a judicial perspective in this state is completely abnormal. So I think that aspect of it has people way more engaged than normal.
Absolutely. You have a question?
What we heard here is very helpful.
Go ahead.
But I've not heard a word about the invasion over the open border. Is that not of concern?
Actually, I think that's a really good point, and absolutely it is. When we poll North Carolina voters, it is one of the top 3 behind inflation is one of the top 3 issues that they're talking about. And I think that particularly when you talk about fentanyl poisoning and what we are seeing across North Carolina, it's now the second or third leading cause of death among young people. I think that there's been a real effort in Democrat messaging to divide the border issue from fentanyl poisoning and not show that they are connected. And I do think that it is very important to voters, and I think it is underestimated probably by pollsters and by politicians. But as we come up to Halloween, when we see some of these things that were, fentanyl coming over the border that looks like candy, and, it's really frightening parents. But then it also goes back to what we have internally called the emerging mad mom. So, those parents that are showing up at school board meetings are concerned about fentanyl, are concerned about crime, are concerned about what their kids are learning in the classroom, about school shutdowns. Something sparked during the school shutdowns that we are seeing more parents run for school board, run for state legislature, run for city council. They're more and more angry, and I think that is going to be a trend that we're going to see probably for 10 years. Much more appearance of parents who are worried about crime, worried about open borders. North Carolina and Greensboro and those areas, we're seeing a lot of influx in our communities, and that's something that I think people are really worried about, particularly as it pertains to crime. Yeah.
Ted Budd mentioned it in the debate Friday
Yes.
night too. He says in a matter of days, fentanyl can come over to North Carolina. He saw right outside, was it Lenore County?
Yes.
Is it he saw there was a
Well, right now, every state just
So-
with mobility
yeah.
is a border.
that is a crucial point.
Renee has a question from.
Yeah, so Wes on Facebook asks, what advantages do you get from a supermajority in the North Carolina legislature, and how significant is that?
Okay, so the question is, what advantages do you get from a supermajority in the North Carolina legislature? You can of
Very
course,
easily, you can override the governor's veto, which is very, very important, as we've seen the past couple of years. I mean, and Governor, doesn't he have a record having the most
Governor
vetoes?
Cooper has vetoed more bills than all other North Carolina governors put together.
Right. Yeah.
By far. So that is the primary reason why I think Republicans want a supermajority back. They had one, lost it, and it is super narrow right now. And I think that's the biggest reason why they want a supermajority. I'm not sure it's in the cards, but certainly, we'll see what it looks like.
Well, you've seen the governor play ball a little bit more with the legislature of late,
Right.
because I think he knows that the situation for him is going to be much worse
And I also,
after November.
Yeah.
So he loses whatever negotiating power he still has. He's trying to obviously expand Medicare and expand some of these Medicaid. He's trying to expand some of these programs that he has, built his political career on as governor, and that's, he's struggling now because I think he knows that he loses a lot of bargaining power after this election in North Carolina.
Yeah.
There's a lot to talk about, but there's one point that sticks with me.
Okay.
Cooper is, I think, been a good governor because I think it's been done. But the one thing that the Republicans failed to do is hold him to account when he went to full-term abortion. He was more in line with the thinking of a blue state than I will call the traditional North Carolina. Nothing was challenged to him. They sent a memo out, you go full-term abortion, and he applied. And it was a shame.
Right.
Because he's not a northerner.
Right.
You never held him accountable for that.
Sure. Right. So the comment question is about Governor Roy Cooper's position on abortion and whether Republicans are holding him accountable for the positions he's taken. I think this also brings us back to the importance of our North Carolina Supreme Court election, because at the end of the day, now with the Dobbs decision, and Democrats are focused on this too, anything that comes through the legislature will likely, I would imagine, end up in front of the North Carolina Supreme Court. But don't let it fool you. Governor Cooper is very calculated. He is very connected with the national Democrats, regardless whether it's New York, California, or North Carolina. So some of these positions are maybe not North Carolina Democrat type of issues, but I think he's going to take a position, particularly if he's looking at the next step in his political career. It's whether or not that North Carolina Democrat is going to resonate with a New York Democrat and a California Democrat. So I think that's a calculated reason, but I agree with you that it's something that needs more focus. But he has some top cover in our North Carolina media, I think. Any other questions? Well, I'm really glad we got a chance to do this. Being a part of Carolina Journal has just been an amazing opportunity, and I feel like we are going to be growing even more. We're going to be doing a lot more video and having a lot more coverage from the legislature, and doing a lot more YouTube and shows and interviews. I'm really excited. We have a new series called Issues and Insiders, and please send me an email if you have an idea, but we're really trying to get some folks in who have been a part of North Carolina politics for a really long time. They know where we've been, where we're going. We've got Auditor Beth Wood coming in tomorrow for an interview. I think Burley Mitchell's on the agenda for down the road a little bit. So we're really trying to bring in some of these folks who have some historic perspective on North Carolina, not just what's coming and what's happening on November 8th, to get an idea of who we are as an electorate and how we play such a critical role in national politics, because everybody's paying attention. You can see it with just the money flowing into these races, and being an informed voter is an important part of making sure that you have influence over your communities in the broadest possible sense by paying attention to all of the races on your ballot, not just the Senate. Brooke, is there anything you want to make sure that we talk about a little bit? Amy, anything you want to make sure before we wrap it up?
Right, what we're going to be doing.
Absolutely. Oh, for sure. Why didn't I think of that? We are spend your election night with us, because we are going to be in our studio rolling in all of our experts here in this building. We've got a crazy amount of brain power in this building, and we're excited. We're going to be covering the returns here from Carolina Journal in our studios, and getting good analysis from all of the folks, our grassroots people. I'd love Brene to come in and see what she's saying with some of the data. Of course, Ray talking about those issues that are really important. So we're going to be broadcasting live from our studios, covering that election coverage in a midterm. Imagine what we're going to do in 2024. Ray, anything you want to?
How can we watch that?
You can see that on. Thank you. You'll be able to see that on our Facebook page, and of course on our YouTube channel. So I'll be looking forward to hearing you, and we'll be taking your questions as well as we go through the evening. Ray, do you want to talk about anything else?
Yeah, I mean, I think the main thing is to be encouraged. We still have the opportunity to go out and vote and have our voices heard,
That's right.
and to be a part of the process of changing government. When we think about our founding, we have a lot of internal conflict. We have a lot of internal spats going on. But I think the structure of our government is sound. I think the ideas of our government, the founding principles, are sound. And if we can kind of latch onto that more, if we can be, I think, more of a, it's okay to disagree. That's one of the things, like, sometimes someone will send me an opinion piece and they'll go, "You're going to disagree with it." And I go, "That's good. I want to disagree with you." And it's okay to disagree, and it's okay to fight stuff out, but to be civil and to be a person, that kind of reflects the virtuous citizen, I think is all important in America right now. And that's one of the things. I get discouraged sometimes if I mentioned this before, but I'm on social media for a long time, and I'm looking at the crazies out there, and the people that I think really have the worst interest of the bad part of politics in their hearts. And I just would encourage people to be encouraged about this nation, be encouraged about the civic process, because I still think there's a lot of good things to go on out there, to reflect in your own, and to be an example, right? To be an example of what a virtuous citizen is, and what a person is that is engaged in the process, and to show what that is, because there's obviously a lot of darkness out there that people that are engaged with the John Locke Foundation, that represent the John Locke Foundation, or attend events can be a counterexample to some of the goofiness that we all laugh at on social media.
Yeah, I love your Friday outrageous stories. That's one of my favorite things in the week.
Yeah.
I think it really does get a lot of attention, and it highlights some of that craziness, but also shows that there is something to be excited about. And we've got so much growth, and North Carolina is such a fantastic place. People are, fighting to get in here. So keeping it, shaping it, and how we want this to be as we grow is an important part of this election and the ones to come. All right.
And if you haven't checked in yet with Savannah at the end, please do so. But thank you guys so much.